Hello, I'm Charlie Walbridge, and I'm here to talk to you about the glory days of Cheat River rafting, the period of time when the Cheat River saw over 40,000 people every season going down the river. It was an amazing, fun time. Now, I guess it all started in 1957 when John Berry led a group of 5 people on the first run of the Cheat Canyon. Took them 2 days. They camped at the base of High Falls, and after that, the word gradually spread around, and paddlers from all over the East Coast started coming by. Now, commercial whitewater rafting started in Ohiopyle, Pennsylvania, in 1964. That's on the East Coast. The Westerners have been doing it for a number of other years. But Lance Martin founded Wilderness Voyagers that year, and in 1967, Ralph McCarty founded Mountain Streams and Trails, which was the company that I worked for. Now, let me first show you a couple of pictures. That's John Berry in the Cheat Canyon on that first run. He was running in a half-decked wooden canvas canoe. And now I want to talk about my boss, Ralph William McCarty. Ralph was an amazing individual. He was He started out his career as an engineer. He was a barnstorming pilot, a designer for both the aircraft and the automotive industries. He held dozens of patents. One of the patents was for something called extruded hone. Now, what is an extruded hone, you ask? Well, Mike McCarty, his son, tells me that one night Ralph is running around grabbing all the silly putty from Mike and Mark and Liz and taking it all down to his basement, where he mixes it up with an abrasive and forces it down through the inside of a pipe. What he was trying to do was polish the inside of a pipe, because a smooth polished pipe passes liquids a lot more quickly. That became a multi-million-dollar company. It's still in existence. And for another career, he decided to become a river outfitter before anybody really knew what river outfitters were. Now, he had been involved in canoeing for a long time. He'd been a founding member of Cleveland's Mad Hatter's Canoe Club. He had also been an instructor at the Western Pennsylvania Whitewater School, which was one of the first schools of its kind. He had a lot of experience, and what he decided to do was to create a new boat, and here is that boat. That's Ralph himself in a ducky of his design. What he did was he took a Metzler ducky, which was a German-made boat. He got Chuck Tummins, who ran a fiberglass company out in Ohio, and who later got into the canoe and kayak boat and paddle business, got him to design a deck for it. The deck had a cockpit rim, and he put a spray skirt on it. And you could do things with that boat. He mostly took people down the lower Yaak, but he was running people down the Big Sandy and the upper Yaak and the Cheat Canyon. Now, at some point, Ralph decided that what he was going to do was to get a raft, so that people who didn't want to paddle a ducky could still come along on the trip. And he got this big nondescript surplus raft that people called the Black Maria. And he soon figured out it was a heck of a lot easier to sell seats on the Black Maria than it was to sell seats on the ducky. And so he gradually moved into being a rafting outfitter. Now, how did he get over to the Cheat, you might ask? Well, he was looking for something that he could do in the springtime, because Ohiopyle State Park had started, and there had been several deaths, and they really didn't want people running at spring high water, and you really couldn't reliably book trips on the Lower Yakutat Spring. But the Cheat, on the other hand, runs at a relatively modest level quite often. And when it's too high, you can always take people to the Narrows. And this is what things look like on at the Mountain Streams and Trails launch site back in the late 60s and early 70s. The clientele was mostly male. They were looking for adventure, and we gave them as much adventure as they could stand. Now, the rafts that we used were also of his design. You can see that the end of the raft has two, goes off with two ends rather than being rounded. We sort of call those Ralph's rockets. He said that the boats would track better and that they would be easier to get into, and that may well have been true. They also tended to flip a lot, and that was something that we all had to deal with as river guides. Now, the trips on the Cheat were pretty much the same thing as the Yak. They were the guide-assisted format, which meant that you didn't have a guide in every boat, but you had guides coming along, sort of helping people get down the river and getting them out of trouble when they found trouble. And this format worked pretty well on what we call the old Cheat. This is the pre-flood Cheat. Before 1985, and we'll talk about the flood a little bit later. But it was a lot like the Yak, just a bit harder, twice as long. Now, how did someone like me become a guide? Well, back in the 70s, it was a very small paddling community. The boats were mostly home-built. It was very rare to find a boat that find a boat for sale that wasn't used, although there were a few small-scale builders. I ended up buying my first C1 from John Berry, who started a business, well, I guess in the early 70s sometime. But with the boats being homemade, the gear being homemade, most people being self-taught, it was a small group and everybody knew each other. You might come to the parking lot and look at the vehicles, and you'd say, "Oh, I see Rick and Donna are back together again." Or you'd look down the river and you'd see two figures way in the distance, and you'd say, "That looks like Jack, and he's got a new paddle jacket." It was that small. Everybody knew each other, and when we were running the Yak, we'd often hitch rides out with the outfitters, and we'd return the favor by helping them pick up the pieces. Usually it's swimmers and double hydraulic in River's End. There were a lot of swimmers and a lot of paddles floating around, and we'd always help, and it was an easy step from there to occasional employment. My first weekend of guiding came when somebody broke into my car and stole my wallet, and I was trying to hit up my buddy Greg Green for a few bucks, and Greg said, "Yeah, I can do better. I can get you a job." And he introduced me to Bob Marietta, and I worked the next two days as a safety boater. Very informal, no real training. I tried out for the U.S. team in 1975, didn't make it. And in 1976, a friend of mine who had been working on and off in Ohiopyle said, "You really ought to go out there. They need weekend guides on the Cheat." So I went out there with John, and I met the boys, and we did guide training. Guide training consisted of running the river, playing the waves, and just generally showing that you knew what you were doing. If you, you know, if you stumbled and you swam, well, you might end up in the raft. But they were really anxious to get guides because they were very busy. They ran on most weekends, Saturday and Sunday, 8 trips a day, 40 people each, and they needed 4 guides to go with each trip, and they were short-handed. I remember hearing a story that Ralph once put an ad in the Pittsburgh Press for guides, and a whole bunch of people showed up, and it's March and it's cold and the river's high and everybody piles in the raft, and they just were sort of guided down the river, and apparently it was a long, horrendous day. And then I said, well, how many of these guys stuck around and came for guides? Because they had about 30 or 40 people. He says, oh, only a couple, but they were really good. And that's and that's what the training was like. We didn't do first aid training, we didn't do rescue training, but the guys were very competent. They were good boaters. They knew how to move around and get things done. Now, when the people would check in, it isn't like it is today. There's no counter. There's no restrooms. They had a couple of porta-johns. There were no wetsuit rentals. You just kind of changed into your river clothes in your car, and you lined up, and they gave you a paddle and a life jacket, and herded you down to the boats and loaded you up. And we put in just above the Walbridge Bridge, and so while you're floating down to the first rapid, you get the talk up, and then things start to happen. Decision Rapid was called because some people had a pretty rough time in Decision, and it was a last chance to have an easy walkout. And I'm told, particularly in the early days, that you had people taking that option fairly regularly. But after that was Beach Run Rapid, which, unlike today, had a pretty good sized center hole at some of the higher levels. That was always good for creating some swimmers. Then Big Nasty, no hole back then, just a wave train. Even Nastier had a weird pinning rock. There was a pour-over rock and then another rock behind it, and the raft would go in and sit in there just like a piece of toast in a toaster. And you'd have an awful time getting anything out. Sometimes they just tied the boat off, distributed the people, and came back for it later when the water went down. Right below Even Nastier was lunch, and lunch was nothing special. Ralph always used to say that these people are going to be hungry, so there's no sense wasting good food on them. We would have PB&J, mystery meat, and apples, and generic soda. Now, as lunch progressed, they would say that if you need to use the facilities, boys go downstream, girls go upstream. You can throw apple cores into the river, into the woods, but do not throw any lunch meat into the woods because there is a chipmunk in there, and it gets carnivorous, and he's big. He's 95 pounds, and there's nothing meaner than a 95-pound chipmunk looking for his next bite of meat. After that, we would head down through Cue Ball and Teardrop, High Falls, which really hasn't changed much. Coliseum was a long boulder rapid. It actually went way, way left of where the river goes now. And then Pete Morgan Rapid at the end is named after the fellow who owned a gas station on the river, on the right-hand side of the road, just before you cross the bridge in Albright. Pete would read the gauge for people and tell them what the river was running, and that was very important to the early paddlers, because this is before the days of online river readings. Heck, it was before the days when you could call into a recording. So that these were so that he really performed a service to the early paddlers. Now, high water. We did not take people down over 4 feet. The ideal runs back then were between 1.5 and 2.5 feet. Anything over 3 feet was high, and as it started to get up towards 4 feet, it got wild. We would, particularly down in Coliseum, you would often feel that you were about 1 or 2 guides short to deal with all the carnage. We got everybody out okay, but it gave me a few worries. But these were young men in their 20s, and they were looking for adventure, and we didn't coddle them. Ralph was sort of had this notorious philosophy about customer service. He would, you'd hear him on the phone talking to somebody, and he'd say, yes sir, I've listened to you, now it's time for you to listen to me. Everything you say may be true, but remember one thing, I have your money, and you have my sympathy. That was Ralph. We called him Crazy Ralph because he was always full of ideas, talking about one thing then the other thing. But when although most of his ideas were completely crackpot, some of them were just amazingly on target, like rafting the Cheat River, like the ducky he built. He was remarkable. There will never be another one like him. Now, the Cheat Canyon campground back then, you know how full it is on Cheat Fest weekend? It was that full every single weekend. And it would get pretty rowdy. I can remember waking up in the middle of the night because I heard a gunshot, and I go out there, out of my car, and there is Grant Tichnell, who is the owner of the campground. He's dressed in a sleep shirt with one of those long caps that has a tail that comes down. He looked like something out of a fairy tale, but he had a cowboy gun belt on him. And what had apparently happened is that some people had started a fire, and the fire had caught on a couple of tents, and he's screaming, "You boys get out of here! I've called the law! Get out of my campground!" Well, when things were crazy, he was pretty easy to deal with. Now, Grant liked to drink, and he would be sitting behind his desk at the campground, and sometimes he'd fall asleep. It was $5 a night, and sometimes we'd just go in and we'd take money and we'd put it in his pocket. And so by the end of the evening, there'd be quite a bit of money in that pocket. He was a good fellow. I miss him. And there were no rentals until Mike Minke changed that. Ralph always said that the rentals would be too much trouble. Well, Michael decided to prove him wrong. He got one of these big bread trucks and he filled it up with wetsuits. And he would rent those puppies out like, I forget what it was, but it was a significant amount of money. And then at the end of the day, he'd take the wetsuits, he'd hang them all up, he'd start a kerosene heater in there, he'd pop the vent at the top of the truck, and by morning the suits would be all dried out and ready to use. Now, I think if I'd have been Mike, I would have been a lot shyer about letting people know how well I was doing. He would be parading around the campground with a trucker's wallet full of cash in one hip pocket, and a pistol on the other hip. But he drank a lot, and I was always afraid that somebody was going to roll him and take his money. But it never happened. But all the other outfitters, and there were by this time probably a dozen or so people who ran trips occasionally, and 3 or 4 major outfitters. These guys took note of what he was doing, and the next year everyone was renting wetsuits, and that pretty much put Michael out of business. Now, you would get all kinds of interesting groups. Some of them, you know, you kind of hoped that they never came back. One of them was what we referred to as the Gay Weightlifters Club. It was a bunch of very buff guys running around in bikini bathing suits. They always came right around Memorial Day, so it was real warm. And they'd be laughing and giggling and pinching each other. And Jim Finn was guided one trip, and Jim was a really good-looking guy. He looked kind of like Tom Selleck. And at the end of the day, I said, "Hey, Jim, how were the Gay Weightlifters this time?" And he just gave me a dirty look. And he pulls up his shirt. There were pinch marks all over his body. Now, there's one thing about river guides is we got a lot of experience handling trouble. And a lot of times, if somebody got stuck on a rock, you'd eddy out behind them and talk them off of it. "Hello, sir. Yes, I need everybody to get out on the rock. Yes, you too, sir, and bring your paddle, please. Yes, sir. Okay. Now, what you're going to do is I want you to lift the end of your boat, and when it starts moving, I want you to jump in. Like right now!" Usually work pretty well. But sometimes you get real trouble. And I can remember one time we were going through Coliseum, and there was one chute that had a rock in it, which was known as trap rock. It didn't cause rafts much trouble, but it periodically would pin a hard boater, and there was a hard boater very seriously pinned and screaming for help. And Chip Quaich and I were guiding, and we were boat guides, and we just ran our boat up on shore and started running, pushing our way past a whole bunch of spectating club boaters. And Chip hopped into the river, and I threw him a rope. We were able to get him off. We were used to that. We dealt with a lot of that sort of thing. It was an incredible education. Now, with 8 trips a day, 40 people a trip each, that's a lot of people going in and out of Jenkinsburg. And if you know Jenkinsburg, you know that the road is terrible. And they were running school buses coming in the Masontown side, because at that time the Valley Point side had deteriorated to the point that it was practically unusable. And we always told people that the ride out was scarier than the river. I don't think that was necessarily true, but it was definitely wild. Getting those buses up. They use CB radios to talk to each other, and if you were a private boater, best thing to do would be to wait at the top of the gorge and just hop in behind a school bus and go down the river. But sometimes there were problems. Like maybe one of the buses would develop mechanical problems, or one of the trips would have a pinned boat, and they'd be stuck, and then another trip would stop and help them, and so you get like 2 or more trips showing up at once, and so you've got all these people milling around Jenkinsburg, which back then was a real mud hole, and on top of it all, this often happened when the weather was really bad. But there was one time when one of our guides got an idea. It was a trip. He was on a trip with a bunch of high school girls from someplace in Virginia. They were very attractive, but seriously underage. But that didn't stop Crazy Dave. And he'd been trying to impress these girls the whole trip, and the girls were not the least bit impressed. So he decides he's going to impress them by jumping off of the superstructure of the Jenkinsburg Bridge. Now, people do jump off the bridge, and it is not recommended. I mean, you do it right, it's quite a thrill. You do it wrong, you can hurt yourself. Our manager, Bob Seiler, landed funny, and he said he was pissing blood for 3 days. But, so Dave gets up to the superstructure, and he jumps off. And partway down, his legs got apart just a little bit. And he immediately tried to cover himself, but he couldn't get there fast enough. And he came up screaming. He had his underpants shoved where the sun never shines, along with a considerable quantity of water. And he had to be immediately evacuated to Morgantown to get it taken care of. I never jumped off the bridge. Never had the interest, and certainly don't regret that. Now, we would be, usually what would happen is we would bring our trip out, get them on the bus, and we would load the rafts, while the trip before us would get on the bus with our guests. And loading the rafts, there was a real amount of skill to throwing the raft into the truck just right. If you were cool, you would throw it so hard, it would be two of you, and you throw it so hard it would hit the end of the truck and bounce onto the pile just perfect. But sometimes it would not go far enough and it would sort of hang down, and you really had to watch yourself, particularly if you were in front, because you'd throw the raft and the boat could come down and smack you into the truck bed. I usually kept my helmet on for that operation. Now, afterwards, we often go back to Albright and just hang out. One time we were hanging out and some people started screaming, "There's some people caught in the Albright Power Dam," and a bunch of us ran up there and used ropes to pull a raft with about cheap raft with about 3 people in it out of the hydraulic. If we hadn't been there, they certainly would have been killed. There was another time when one of our guides, John Connolly, had been trying to get a woman on the trip to show him some interest, and it looked like things weren't going too well. It was pretty tough anyway, because women were no more than 10-15% of the trip, and a lot of them came with boyfriends. Well, we're down at the put end, razzing John for all of this, and this lady shows up and she says, "Hey John, I got a bottle of wine. Want to go someplace?" And of course he left to the cheers and catcalls from the entire guide staff. Another thing that I remember very much was the cheat suite. This was the second floor of a building across the road, which used to be the bank, and the cheat suite was, well, let's just say, it wasn't clean. Now the water wasn't drinkable, but at least the flush toilets worked. And usually, unless the weather was atrocious, I'd go camp in my truck. I still remember one evening when Chip Quaich brought his very attractive girlfriend, Bet, with him. And we're sitting in a room talking to, 3 of us and maybe one other talking. And you'd watch these guys come in the door. They'd take a look at Bet, and they'd walk into the edge of another door. Just bam! And you know how much that hurts. We watched 2 or 3 guys do this. And of course, Bet had no clue what was going on, but Chip and I knew what was going on. Now, one day, a bunch of guys come into town, and they say they're Lehigh guides. They're guides from the Lehigh River in eastern Pennsylvania. Well, the Lehigh is class 2-3, and the Cheat is class 3-4, with maybe a little 5 thrown in there if the water is up. And they're swaggering around like they're some kind of big deal. And I remember Dave Crosby looked at one of them and said, "Lehigh's not a whitewater run, it's a damn float trip." Well, we had to show them a good time, so we took them on the river, and we would take them down blind chutes, and we'd make a fast move at the other end. We'd sucker them into holes that were much too deep for fun playing. That's how we showed a little Cheat River hospitality. Now, when the water was over 4 feet, we would adjourn to the Narrows, and the Narrows trips were always pretty wild. And there was one high water trip where there was a boatload of people who were Sikhs from India, and they had turbans on, and they went over the pour-over at Calamity, and they were thrown end for end, and as they're going for end over end, their turbans unwound. How do we know this? Well, somebody was taking movies, and those movies were shown from time to time, and we would be over at Cheat River Outfitters, and they'd be showing different movies, and people would start chanting "Swamis, Swamis, Swamis," and then Eric would put it on. That was one of many things which was lost in the 1985 flood. And now there's another time when they got a little more than they bargained for. The river that night was about 2.8. The next morning, it's risen. It's about 4.5 feet, so they're up to the Narrows. What they didn't know is there was a huge slug of water coming down the river, and by the time they put in, it was probably between 12 and 14 feet. And the first trip was just demolished. And one guy is stranded on a midstream rock. Well, it was a shoreline rock at normal levels, but this was a midstream rock. And here they are sitting on this rock in the middle of this super high frothing river. And the rock is covered with snakes. Now the snakes aren't being difficult because they're scared, and they're just looking for a place to be safe too. John Lichter, who was the manager, eddied out behind the rock, and he knew immediately that this was not going to be something he could do, because there was a bad strainer just downstream. So instead, he gets the word that there is a helicopter in the vicinity, and this helicopter was piloted by a Vietnam veteran who did a one-skid landing on the rock and got the guy off. I don't think he took any of the snakes with him, but he did get the guy off. And of course, after the first trip met this kind of trouble, Ralph McCarty, who was driving up along the Narrows, saw what was happening and canceled all the rest of the trips. But it's one of the reasons that the Cheat got its name, because it would rise up suddenly and take things from you. Of course, some of the locals would say, to call it the Cheat, because it would cheat you out of your life. But I think it was more that you'd go and you'd be doing some laundry or some other work, and you'd leave it and you'd come back and the river would be 2 feet higher, and it'd be all gone. Now, let's talk a little bit about the massive 1985 flood. This is a picture of Albright, and as you can see, the flood took out about a third of the town. And this is a picture of the Albright Bridge when the river is coming down. I mean, think about it. The river was probably 3 or 4 feet higher. It was going over the bridge with a really big flow, and it changed probably about 10–20% of the rivers in the canyon, and one of the things it did is it created a huge hole at the bottom of Big Nasty. Now that hole isn't that big at lower levels, but the first trip that encountered it was what was later known as Black Saturday.